It was simply a formal picture of a newly married pair from the year 1895. Yet, if you observed her hand more intently, the late-day sun poured through the grand windows of the Charleston Historical Society, painting elongated shapes across the workspace of Dr. Maya Richardson. She had spent the last 3 hours sorting through a collection of gifted images, her vision blurry from studying washed-out sepia prints and damaged photographic surfaces. The majority were commonplace. Families arranged in unnatural stances, serious-faced youngsters, and senior pairs gazing intently at the lens as if defying the passage of time itself. Then, she discovered picture number 47. It depicted a youthful African-American pair, likely in their 20s, positioned before an artist-painted scene of a Victorian sitting room. The gentleman was dressed in a dark, somewhat ill-fitting suit, his stance erect and proper. The lady at his side wore a high-collared gown decorated with delicate lace patterns, her hair styled up in a manner popular during the final decade of the 19th century. On the reverse side, in faint graphite script, was inscribed, "Thomas and Sarah, Charleston, South Carolina, April 1895. Maya nearly placed it aside to continue. Nearly. Yet, an instinct compelled her to hesitate. She lifted her magnifier and bent nearer, scrutinizing the woman's features. Sarah's countenance was deliberately empty, her stare locked on the camera with a fierce focus that appeared to pierce through the years. There was no hint of a grin, no kindness, only a disquieting, hollow feeling that contradicted the significant act of sitting for a portrait. A costly and infrequent luxury for an African-American couple in the post-Reconstruction South. Maya's eyes traveled lower, tracing the graceful contour of Sarah's dress to where her hands lay gently at her hips. The right hand dangled in a natural, calm manner, but the left hand, Maya's inhalation halted. The left hand was held in a strange posture, the digits splayed in a distinct arrangement that seemed purposeful. The thumb and forefinger created a tiny ring, while the remaining 3 fingers pointed straight up, fanned slightly apart. It was understated, almost invisible unless one was searching, concealed within the shadows of her dark attire. Maya placed the magnifying glass down, her pulse quickening. She recognized that sign from her academic work on covert signals and coded messages utilized by enslaved individuals. But this picture was from 1895, 3 decades after the Civil War concluded, years after freedom had been declared. Why would a liberated black woman in 1895 be forming a sign of distress within a formal portrait? Maya retrieved her mobile device and captured an image of the photograph, enlarging the section focused on Sarah's hand. The gesture was clear once it was seen. This was not a casual pose or a photographic illusion. This was calculated. This was meant. This was a plea, preserved for 129 years, hoping for a witness. Maya could not get the picture out of her head. That night, inside her compact home overlooking the Charleston port, she laid out duplicates of the image over her dining surface next to her computer and reference texts. The overhead fan rotated lazily, doing little to stir the thick, warm, nighttime atmosphere that clung to the glass. She began with the fundamentals. Thomas and Sarah, Charleston, 1895. No last names, an aggravatingly typical situation for African-American households of the period. Official documents were frequently patchy or intentionally vague, names incorrectly recorded or left out completely by white officials who considered black existence scarcely worth noting. Maya accessed the 1900 National Census Archive and started looking through Charleston County records. The census had occurred a mere 5 years after the picture was taken. If Thomas and Sarah had remained in Charleston, still a proper couple, their names should be listed somewhere in that data. Time elapsed. The lights of the harbor shone in the blackness outside her window. Maya's coffee cooled, abandoned. Then, close to the stroke of 12, she discovered an entry. A Thomas and Sarah residing on Trad Street in Charleston's Upper Peninsula. Thomas was recorded as a woodworker, age 29. Sarah, 26, had no listed profession, implying she probably worked domestic tasks that census officials ignored. They had been wed for 7 years, dating their marriage to approximately 1893, 2 years prior to the portrait. Maya leaned back in her chair, absorbing this knowledge. They were essentially newlyweds, a young pair establishing an existence in one of the most perilous epochs for African Americans in the South. The 1,890 seconds witnessed the emergence of Jim Crow legislation, the organized removal of black voting rights, and a surge of lynch mobs that horrified black populations throughout the area. She recalled statistics from her doctoral studies. In 1895 alone, more than 100 African Americans were lynched in the nation. South Carolina had been especially brutal, with white mobs attacking black men for suspected offenses, or for no cause except to instill fear and dominance. Maya looked once more at the picture, at Thomas's tense stance and baggy clothing, at Sarah's expressionless face and that quiet, urgent hand sign. What became of them? She investigated death certificates next, her stomach knotted with apprehension. The Charleston County archives from that time were fragmented, particularly for black citizens, but she had to attempt. She found nothing for Thomas in 1895, nothing in 1896. She continued her search, year after year, and located him in the 1910 census, still employed as a carpenter, now 39 years of age. But Sarah was no longer listed with him. Maya's fingers shook a little as she entered Sarah's name into the registry of deaths, filtering the inquiry to the period between 1,895 and 1,900. The display loaded gradually, and there it appeared. Sarah, spouse of Thomas, deceased August 1,895, age 26. Recorded cause of death, complications from injuries sustained in a fall. Just 4 months after the picture was taken, Maya reached the Charleston Historical Society at sunrise, incapable of resting after uncovering Sarah's death certificate. The structure was still secured, so she waited on the front staircase with her computer, observing the city stir to life around her. Cargo vans rumbled down the tight lanes, early workers headed for the port, visitors already assembling near the old market. When the security guard finally unbolted the doors at 8 o'clock, Maya was the first individual to enter. She proceeded directly to the records, retrieving the donation file for the photographic set. Every contribution was accompanied by documents stating the donor, the date, and any provided context about the materials. The picture of Thomas and Sarah had been included in a bigger set, gifted 3 months earlier by a probate sale firm, emptying a residence on Trad Street. Maya telephoned the company. A weary-voiced lady picked up after the 5th ring. "I'm attempting to find information regarding a set of photographs your company gifted to the Historical Society," Maya clarified. "It originated from a residence on Trad Street." "Ah, the Morrison property," the woman replied. "A unfortunate circumstance. The proprietor passed with no living relatives. The home had belonged to the family since before the war between the states. We discovered crate after crate of antique pictures in the loft. No one claimed them, so we donated the entire collection. Do you recall anything else in those crates? Any documents, correspondence, records?" "Sweetheart, there were maybe 20 containers. We didn't inspect each one. The bulk of it was trashed, to be truthful. The Historical Society only accepted the photographs." Maya's spirits fell. "Is the property still standing? Has it been fully emptied?" "It should be. The next buyer acquires it next week, but if you wish to inspect the premises, I would advise haste." 2 hours later, Maya was standing before a slender 3-level home on Trad Street. Paint was flaking from the window coverings, and unwanted plants sprouted between the bricks of the walkway. The estate firm had allowed her to examine what was left before the new resident moved in. The interior carried the scent of old dust and decay. Forgotten furniture sat shrouded under white cloths. The sound of her shoes reverberated off the wooden planks as she ascended to the top floor. The room was stifling and still, packed with the accumulated remnants of many years, aged furnishings, storage chests, and containers of clothing damaged by insects. Maya started a methodical examination, unlatching every box, investigating each nook. In a distant corner, concealed behind a damaged rocking chair, she located a wooden box labeled "Assorted Photographs." Within were scattered documents, personal letters, and payment slips, the miscellaneous items the estate company had deemed unimportant. Maya lowered herself to the grimy floorboards and started to read. Most were ordinary. Invoices from local shops, notes concerning society events. Then, near the crate's base, she discovered a folded paper addressed to Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, Trad Street, Charleston. The mailing stamp was dated September 1895. Inside was one page inscribed with precise, formal script. Dear Mrs. Morrison, I am writing to inform you of a most troubling situation concerning your previous domestic employee, Sarah. As you are aware, she left your employ in April of this year subsequent to her marriage. I have recently learned that she was involved in a dreadful incident during August and has since succumbed to her injuries. Her spouse, Thomas, has inquired if you might possess any knowledge regarding Sarah's relatives, as he wishes to inform them of her passing but lacks any information on her background. If you are able to offer any help in this affair, Thomas can be contacted via Reverend Patterson at Emmanuel Church. Most respectfully, Mrs. Catherine Simmons. Maya read the letter 3 times, her thoughts moving rapidly. Sarah had been a domestic servant in this very home. The Morrison family had employed her until her marriage to Thomas in early 1895, and then, a mere 4 months later, she was gone. Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church stood on Calhoun Street, its pale spire towering above nearby structures like a signal fire. Maya had walked by it often, aware of its profound importance in Charleston's African-American history, established in 1817 and destroyed by white officials for alleged connection to a planned 1822 rebellion led by Denmark Vesey, reconstructed, shuttered during the Civil War, and reopened after freedom was declared. This sanctuary had seen it all. Reverend Marcus Johnson greeted her at the door, a lofty gentleman in his 60s with grey hair and compassionate eyes behind circular spectacles. Maya had phoned earlier, outlining her project. Our archives from the 1890 seconds are incomplete, he cautioned, guiding her down to the church's lower level where antique record books and papers were kept in specially controlled units. The building was damaged again during the fires of 1886. We lost much, and documentation was not always consistent, particularly for parishioners who were not literate. I comprehend, Maya stated. I am seeking any information on a pair called Thomas and Sarah, wed around 1893, and a Reverend Patterson who would have been ministering here in 1895. Reverend Johnson retrieved several bound volumes, their leaves aged and delicate. Patterson, indeed. Reverend William Patterson served this congregation from 1890 to 1897. He maintained very detailed logs. Let us look. They seated themselves at a lengthy table beneath the glow of overhead lights, gently turning the fragile sheets. Records of unions, christenings, final rites, lists of members, the identities of individuals who had existed, cared for others, and perished, now just strokes of disappearing ink. Then she saw it. Thomas Daniels and Sarah, married the 7th of April, 1893. Sarah possessed no last name. Reverend Johnson observed that this typically indicated she had been held in bondage, or her parents had been. Often, individuals did not know their familial names, or refused to use the surnames of previous captors. Are there further entries about them? Any other documents? Reverend Johnson turned more of the brittle pages, then stopped. The 28th of August, 1895. Funeral rite for Sarah Daniels, spouse of Thomas. Interred at Magnolia Cemetery, the section for colored people. He lifted his gaze to Maya. Reverend Patterson included a remark here in the edge. Observe. Maya moved nearer. In tiny, tight script, someone had written, Inquiry from T. Daniels regarding marks on deceased. No answers provided. Matter closed. Marks on deceased? Maya murmured. What does that signify? Reverend Johnson's face became grave. In those days, when black individuals died under questionable situations, which was frequent, families would occasionally request examinations, but white officials seldom took interest. Household mishaps, falls, unexpected passings. These were all simple justifications to prevent inquiries concerning brutality. Maya felt a coldness despite the basement's warmth. You believe Sarah's death was not a mishap? I believe, Reverend Johnson said with measured care, that we might never learn the full truth. But Reverend Patterson evidently considered Thomas's worries valid enough to document them. That indicates to me that something was amiss. Maya retrieved her phone and displayed the picture of Thomas and Sarah, enlarging the section focused on Sarah's hand. I discovered this in a donated archive. Does this hand formation hold any significance to you? Reverend Johnson examined the image for a prolonged moment, his expression becoming increasingly grave. I have encountered different versions of this in historical texts. In the era of slavery, it was among the numerous signs employed by individuals seeking aid from the Underground Railroad network. But by 1895, his voice faded as he considered the implication. There were still circumstances where black individuals required covert methods to express danger. Domestic service could be perilous, particularly for young women laboring in white homes. Certain employers overstepped boundaries, and a black woman possessed no legal standing, no safeguard. Sarah was a housemaid, Maya stated. She was employed by the Morrison family on Trad Street until her marriage to Thomas. Reverend Johnson held her gaze, and 4 months after marrying, she is deceased, with injuries on her person that prompted her husband to doubt the official account. I must discover the truth of what occurred to her. The genealogy department of the Charleston County Library took up the whole 3rd level, a silent area populated with microfilm machines, storage cabinets, and scholars hunched over ancient texts. Maya had become a familiar presence over the preceding week, coming at opening time and remaining until the end of the day. She was constructing a profile of the Morrison family, fragment by fragment. James Morrison had been a successful cotton trader before the Civil War. His affluence was founded on the work of enslaved individuals. After the conflict, the family's wealth had declined, but not vanished. They still possessed the Trad Street residence, still hired domestic staff, and still socialized within Charleston's white elite circles. In 1895, the home was occupied by James Morrison, his spouse Elizabeth, and their grown son Robert, who was 28 years of age, 2 years senior to Sarah. Maya located Robert Morrison's name in newspaper archives, primarily in society sections, notices of social engagements, philanthropic gatherings, depictions of soirees at the Morrison residence. The items depicted a youthful man of means, well-educated, anticipated to inherit his father's commercial ventures. Then she discovered something different. A short note in the Charleston News and Courier from July 1895, 1 month prior to Sarah's death. Robert Morrison, son of Mr. and Mrs. James Morrison of Trad Street, departed last Saturday for a lengthy journey through Europe. He is anticipated to remain overseas for the rest of the year. Maya leaned back, her thoughts racing. Why would a young man abruptly depart for Europe in the height of summer? Charleston's high society usually traveled in the winter, seeking colder regions. Summer voyages were uncommon. She looked for additional details concerning Robert Morrison's European travels, but found nothing. No further references, no articles about in his travels, no society page reports on his activities abroad. It was as if he had simply disappeared from history for several months. Then, in January 1896, another brief announcement. Mr. Robert Morrison has returned to Charleston following his lengthy travels and has reassumed his role with Morrison and Company. 5 months abroad, Maya whispered, leaving in July, 1 month before Sarah's death in August. She retrieved her notepad and wrote, April 1895. Thomas and Sarah. Pose for a formal portrait. July 1895. Robert Morrison abruptly departs for Europe. August 1895. Sarah dies from injuries sustained in a fall. January 1896. Robert Morrison returns to Charleston. She stared at the chronology, a dreadful hypothesis taking shape in her mind. That afternoon, Maya went to the Charleston County Courthouse to examine property archives. She located the title for the Trad Street home and connected to it a domestic inventory from 1900 that catalogued all the servants employed by the Morrison family. Sarah, of course, was not listed. She had passed in 1895. But there was another paper, a handwritten memo filed with the inventory, advanced payment issued to Thomas Daniels, carpenter, for domestic repairs and alterations, March 1895. Sum, $200. $200 in 1895 was a massive amount for a black carpenter, equal to many months' income. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she captured an image of the document. Why would the Morrison family pay Thomas such an enormous sum just 1 month before Sarah left their service? Was it compensation for labor? Or was it something different? Was it a payment for him to take Sarah away, to marry her and remove her from the household before something became apparent, before inquiries could be raised? Mia considered the photograph again, Sarah's desperate hand signal, her death a mere 4 months later, and Robert Morrison escaping to Europe just in time to be absent when Sarah died. Maya understood she needed to locate Thomas Daniels' own testimony, his own words, his version of events. She returned to Emmanuel Church, hoping Reverend Johnson could assist her in accessing records she could not find elsewhere. Church minutes, Reverend Johnson proposed. We maintained detailed records of committee gatherings, particularly the Benevolent Society. They assisted congregation members in crisis, collected funds for burials, supported widows and orphans, and intervened when people were harmed. They located the Benevolent Society archives in a distinct ledger, its sheets filled with names and condensed notes regarding the cases the committee had addressed. Maya's pulse quickened as she turned the brittle pages, looking for any reference to Thomas or Sarah Daniels. Then, dated the 15th of September 1895, 2 weeks after Sarah's funeral, she found it. Meeting convened regarding Thomas Daniels' petition for an inquiry into the death of his wife, Sarah. Brother Daniels appeared before the committee. He testified that his wife suffered from no prior sickness or frailty. He stated she was fearful in her final weeks, speaking of threats, but would not provide details. On the morning of her death, he received a message that Sarah had fallen at the Morrison residence, where she sometimes visited her former co-worker, Ruth. He rushed to the house and found Sarah unresponsive. The Morrison family physician declared the cause of death to be a head injury. Brother Daniels observed bruising inconsistent with a fall, marks upon her wrists, and defensive wounds on her arms. He requested a formal investigation. Committee decision. Given the current social climate and the peril to colored citizens who pursue grievances against white families, we advised Brother Daniels not to press the matter further. The risk of violent reprisal is too severe. We will raise a collection to assist with funeral costs and provided $45 to help Brother Daniels establish a carpentry workshop in Columbia, South Carolina. We advised his immediate departure from Charleston. Maya read it twice, then a third time, her chest constricting. They had paid Thomas to leave the city. The church itself, the community that should have been his defenders, had instructed him to flee rather than seek justice for his slain wife. Because that was what this was. Sarah had not fallen. She had been killed. Maya looked up at Reverend Johnson, who was reading over her shoulder, his face somber. They were shielding him, he said quietly. In 1895, if a black man accused a white family of murder, even with proof, he would have been lynched. The committee was saving his life. Reverend Johnson understood. They were attempting to preserve his life. But what of Sarah's life? What of her right to justice? There was no justice for black women in 1895, Reverend Johnson stated, his tone laden with ancient sorrow and frustration, particularly not when the accused were white men from influential families. The committee performed the only action they believed was available to them. They rescued the one they still could. Maya, considered Thomas, compelled to abandon his home, his community, his congregation, just to evade violent retribution for having the courage to question how his wife died. She thought of Sarah. Her life ended at 26, her killing disguised as a mishap and erased from memory. Except she had not been entirely erased, because she had sent a message, a sign conserved within that portrait. I must travel to Columbia, Maya declared. I need to learn what became of Thomas after he was driven from Charleston. Reverend Johnson gave a slow nod. I have associates at churches in Columbia. Allow me one day to make some inquiries. That night, Maya sat in her home, the picture of Thomas and Sarah leaning against her computer. She examined Sarah's face once more, now perceiving it in a new light. Not empty, not hollow, but meticulously restrained, desperately, holding a mask of calm over a core of pure terror. For how long had Sarah known she was in peril? Had Robert Morrison attacked her while she was employed in his home? Had a pregnancy made the circumstance impossible to conceal? Was the marriage to Thomas orchestrated to provide a veil? And then, when that proved insufficient, had they ended her life to permanently ensure her silence? Maya would likely never uncover every specific detail, but she understood enough. She knew Sarah had been desperate enough to hazard leaving a coded plea in a formal picture, understanding it could be the sole proof that outlived her. And now, 129 years later, a person had finally recognized it. The journey to Colombia lasted 2 hours, traversing flat coastal terrain that slowly ascended toward the Midlands. The scenery transformed from wetlands and ancient oaks to woodlands of pine and rust-colored earth. Maya possessed an address, or more accurately, a district where Thomas Daniels might have set up his carpentry shop in the latter part of 1895. Reverend Johnson's connection in Colombia was Pastor Ruth Williams of Bethel Church, a woman in her 70s with hair of silver woven into braids and perceptive, knowing eyes. She greeted Maya in the church office, which carried the scent of coffee and aged documents. "Reverend Johnson informed me of your project," Pastor Williams said. "I retrieved the archives we possess from the 1892. Our collection is limited. A blaze in 1902 damaged a section of the building, but I discovered something of note." She set a small, weathered journal on the desk between them. Its leather cover was fissured with time. Inside, someone had maintained precise financial entries, names, dates, sums of money. This was the ledger of Reverend Thomas Nathaniel, Pastor Williams clarified. He led this congregation from 1893 to 1905. He documented every member of the flock, every christening, every union, every burial, and he noted when new members arrived from other cities. She turned the fragile sheets until she located an entry from October 1895. Thomas Daniels, carpenter, arrived from Charleston with letter of introduction from Reverend Patterson of Emmanuel AME. Brother Daniels has suffered great loss. Wife Sarah, murdered by white family. Death falsely recorded as accident. Brother Daniels sought justice but forced to flee due to threat of lynching. Welcomed into our community. Provided room at boarding house on Washington Street. Committee raised funds to help establish workshop. Maya felt a heat behind her eyes. Murdered. The word she had been circling, afraid to state outright, was written plainly in this antique book. Another reverend, another black church leader recording what the white officials had refused to see. "Is there anything more about him?" Maya inquired. Pastor Williams nodded, turning more of the brittle pages. He remained in Colombia for 3 years. The archives indicate he was a talented craftsman. The congregation commissioned him to restore our benches in 1896 and construct new storage units in 1897. He was involved in the church, dependable, respected. But, she paused, he was also profoundly wounded. Reverend Nathaniel wrote several pastoral notes about providing counsel to Brother Daniels through his sorrow and rage. Here, March 1896. Brother Daniels struggles with nightmares, still speaks of his beloved Sarah, of his failure to protect her, assured him her death was not his fault, but he cannot forgive himself for surviving. Maya's throat constricted. She imagined Thomas receiving that $200 payment from the Morrison family, likely believing it was for legitimate work, unaware it was a payment to take Sarah away. She pictured him arriving at the Morrison house to find his wife's body, observing the bruises and defensive wounds, knowing instantly what had transpired, yet being utterly powerless to speak the truth aloud. "When did he depart Colombia?" Maya asked. Pastor Williams turned to a later page, from 1898. No forwarding address. Reverend Nathaniel noted, "Brother Daniels departed for Chicago to join the Great Migration North. Prayed for his safe journey and healing from his wounds, both visible and invisible. He carries Sarah's memory like a stone. Chicago. The Great Migration would not peak for another 20 years, but already black Southerners were fleeing northward, searching for security, possibility, and an escape from the terror of Jim Crow. Did he maintain contact with the church? Not that I can locate. Once people left, communication was challenging. Letters were misplaced. Addresses changed. Pastor Williams shut the record book gently. But I will tell you what I believe, based on 40 years of ministry. Thomas Daniels never ceased mourning for Sarah. He never stopped holding himself responsible. And he probably never uttered her name again to any soul who did not already know their story. Maya drove back to Charleston as the sun descended, coloring the horizon in shades of amber and crimson. She contemplated trauma inherited through generations, stories lost because they were too agonizing to repeat, and justice denied so utterly that even speaking of the wrong became a perilous act. Yet she also contemplated defiance, Sarah's bold hand signal, Thomas's frantic efforts to prompt an official inquiry, the church networks that meticulously recorded the reality. Even as the sanctioned history fabricated lies, Sarah's narrative had endured, concealed in the open for 129 years. Now, Mia was faced with the decision of what to do with it. Mia dedicated the next 3 weeks to writing. She labored deep into the night inside her home, encircled by copies of records, pictures, and chronological charts covering every available space. The fan rotated above, doing little to stir the heavy atmosphere that pressed on in the windows like the burden of the past itself. She wrote of Sarah, of her existence as a domestic servant in a white home, of the precariousness black women endured in the Charleston of the 1890 seconds. She wrote of the portrait and its concealed message, of Thomas's account and the church's frantic measure to preserve his life by compelling him to flee. She wrote of the Morrison family and Robert Morrison's well-timed voyage to Europe, of the $200 payment and the concealed killing. She wrote of how history had betrayed Sarah, how the official documents labeled her death a mishap, how no periodical reported it, how she had been wiped away as completely as if she had never lived, save for that picture, save for that one desperate sign preserved in time. Maya presented the paper to the Journal of Southern History, a scholarly, peer-reviewed periodical read by academics, investigators, and teachers nationwide. She attached high-definition copies of the photograph, typed versions of every document she had uncovered, and a thorough explanation of her investigative approach. The piece was named A Message in the Open, Sarah Daniels and the Unvoiced Evidence of an 1895 Charleston Portrait. 6 weeks afterward, the journal approved it for publication. But Maya understood a scholarly paper was insufficient. The general populace would never read the Journal of Southern History. Sarah's account required an audience beyond the academic world. It needed to be approachable, easy to disseminate, and seen. She reached out to the director of the Charleston Historical Society and suggested a display, Voices Unheard, Coded Communications and Historical Images. The focal point would be Sarah's portrait, accompanied by informational displays clarifying the hand gesture, Thomas's testimony, and the historical backdrop of violence targeting black women in the post-Reconstruction South. The director, Dr. Patricia Holloway, a black woman in her 50s who had dedicated her professional life to chronicling Charleston's African-American past, agreed instantly. "This is precisely the type of narrative we must share," Dr. Holloway stated during their planning meeting. "The accounts that provoke discomfort, that confront the cleansed rendition of history. Sarah is worthy of remembrance." The display launched in October, precisely 129 years after Thomas Daniels had escaped Charleston for Columbia. The inaugural evening attracted over 300 attendees, scholars, members of Charleston's black community, teachers, and members of the press. Maya stood near the portrait, observing visitors lean in to study Sarah's hand, witnessing the precise moment they comprehended what they were seeing. She observed tears, fury, acknowledgement, and sorrow. A crew from a local television station questioned her. "Why is this picture significant?" the journalist inquired. Maya looked at Sarah's likeness. "Because for 129 years, Sarah has been awaiting someone to recognize her plea, to admit what was done to her. History attempted to eliminate her, to minimize her death to a brief note that read, 'Fell.' But she resisted being eliminated. She left proof. She retaliated in the only manner available to her, by ensuring that one day, a person would learn the truth." The story spread rapidly. First local, then regional, and finally national media platforms reported it. Online networks were flooded with individuals sharing the picture, voicing fury over Sarah's murder, linking it to modern conversations about violence against black women, about cases that are never properly examined, about how the legal system fails its victims. Within a week, Maya was receiving communications from around the nation, from historians who possessed similar images in their archives and were now inspecting them more closely, from genealogists attempting to find links to Sarah or Thomas, from instructors seeking to incorporate the account into their curricula. Then, a fortnight after the display's opening, Maya received a message that transformed everything. The subject line read, "I believe Thomas Daniels was my great-great-grandfather." Jerome Washington was a secondary school history instructor from Chicago, a contemplative man in his 40s, with graying hair at his temples and his ancestors' same gentle, perceptive gaze. He had seen the news report about Sarah's picture and instantly identified the Daniels surname, a name handed down in his family, alongside pieces of a painful tale never fully shared. Maya met him at a cafe in Charleston's historic area. Jerome had flown in specifically for this encounter, carrying a binder of family papers and images. "My great-great-grandfather, Thomas Daniels, arrived in Chicago from South Carolina in 1898, Jerome clarified, arranging documents on the table between their drinks. "Family law," said he had been wed before and lost his spouse in a calamity he never wished to discuss. He wed again in Chicago around 1902, raised a family, and created a prosperous woodworking company. But it was said he suffered from bad dreams for all his remaining years. My great-grandfather recalled him shouting in his sleep, calling a woman's name. Sarah. Jerome's hands shook slightly as he retrieved a tiny, faded picture. "This was among my grandmother's possessions. I never understood its meaning until I read your article." Maya accepted the photograph delicately. It depicted an older Thomas, likely in his 60s, standing in what appeared to be a carpentry workshop. Behind him, almost hidden on the wall, was a framed picture. Maya took out her magnifying lens and inspected the image on the wall. It was Sarah, the very same portrait from 1895, the one Mia had discovered in the Charleston Historical Society archives. "He kept her picture his entire life," Maya murmured. "He never let her memory fade." Jerome's eyes glistened. "When I saw your article, when I learned what happened to Sarah, I finally comprehended why my great-great-grandfather was the man he was, why he never spoke of his earlier days, why he immersed himself in his labor like a man attempting to escape a phantom. He was trying to escape shame," Maya said softly. "The guilt of a survivor." The church archives from Columbia stated he held himself responsible for failing to shield Sarah. But how could he have shielded her? Jerome's voice faltered. A black man in 1895 Charleston, opposing a white family. He would have been murdered if he had tried to defend her. He did the sole thing possible. He endured. He carried her memory, and he handed down a heritage, even if he could not speak of it openly. Maya spent the remainder of the day with Jerome, revealing all she had learned. They visited the Historical Society display together. Jerome stood before Sarah's portrait for a very long time, tears tracing paths down his face. "Thank you," he finally uttered. "Thank you for recognizing her, for refusing to let her be forgotten." That night, Dr. Holloway organized a special event at the Historical Society where Jerome was invited to speak. Over 100 individuals gathered to hear him discuss his great-great-grandfather and the pain that had reverberated through his family line across generations. "For 129 years, my family bore this sorrow without fully comprehending its source," Jerome stated. "We understood Thomas had been wounded by a profound tragedy, but the details were lost to us. Now we know, and while the truth is agonizing, it is superior to ignorance. It allows me to comprehend my own father's battles with despair, my grandfather's inability to articulate his emotions. The burden of Thomas's suffering has been inherited, one generation after another." He paused, gathering his emotions. "But so has his strength. Thomas did not merely endure. He constructed a new life, raised a family, and served his community. He carried Sarah with him, honoring her memory in the only manner available to him. And now at last we can honor her too. We can speak her name, Sarah Daniels. She existed. Her life had meaning, and she will be remembered." The crowd responded with a standing ovation. Maya observed from the rear of the room, contemplating the mechanisms of history, how the past extends its grasp into the present, and how truth, no matter how deeply interred, eventually emerges into the light. 6 months after the exhibition's debut, Maya stood before the office at Magnolia Cemetery, a modest structure near the gates where the records were housed. She had phoned in advance to explain her purpose. The cemetery superintendent, an older white gentleman named Mr. Harrison, met her carrying a substantial, leather-bound ledger. "The section for colored people is in the rear," he said, his tone detached yet not unfeeling. "It was segregated, naturally. That was the custom of the time. The documentation is incomplete. Many burial sites were never formally marked." They walked through the graveyard together, following meandering trails under ancient live oaks hung with Spanish moss. The atmosphere was dense and quiet, laden with the fragrance of magnolia blooms. In the older parts, ornate sculptures designated the resting places of Charleston's white aristocracy, family crypts, marble cherubs, epitaphs, lauding lives of influence and wealth. The section for colored people was distinct, smaller, more worn headstones, many fractured or toppled, graves identified by plain concrete slabs, or in many instances, by nothing more than slight hollows in the soil where the earth had yielded to forgotten caskets. Mr. Harrison consulted his ledger. "Here it is, Sarah Daniels, interred the 30th of August 1895. Plot 247. They located it in a remote area beneath the shelter of a massive oak. There was no upright monument, only a small, ground-level concrete marker so eroded the name was nearly invisible. Unwanted plants grew densely around it. Maya knelt and cleared the weeds with her hands. She traced the faded engraving with her fingertips. "Sarah," she whispered, "I will ensure you receive a fitting memorial. Everyone will learn your name. Everyone will know your story." And she fulfilled that vow. Through a public fundraising campaign and contributions inspired by the exhibition, Mia gathered sufficient funds to order a proper headstone for Sarah's grave. The marker was crafted from granite, dignified and permanent, bearing an inscription she and Jerome had composed together. "Sarah Daniels circa 1869, August 1895. She spoke her truth in silence. We hear her now in thunder. Beloved wife, remembered always." The unveiling ceremony was held on a balmy April morning, 130 years after Sarah's portrait was taken. Jerome traveled from Chicago with his kin, his wife, his 3 daughters, his aged father, who was Thomas's great-grandson. Members of Emmanuel Church were present, alongside delegates from congregations in Columbia and Chicago, uniting the communities that had sheltered Thomas in his sorrow and exile. Pastor Williams delivered the opening prayer. Reverend Johnson read from sacred texts. Jerome spoke of family, remembrance, and the lengthy path toward justice. Maya spoke last. She described the photograph, the instant she discerned Sarah's hand signal, and the investigation that ensued. She spoke of how readily the testimony of black women is overlooked, their voices dismissed, their narratives erased, and how Sarah had defied that erasure, leaving a message that persisted for 130 years, waiting for a witness. Sarah could not speak aloud in 1895, Maya said. Had she accused Robert Morrison, she would have been disregarded, at best, or punished severely. Had she confided in her husband before the portrait was taken, Thomas might have confronted Morrison and been murdered. So, Sarah executed the most courageous and intelligent action possible. She left proof. She ensured that one day someone would perceive her plea for help and demand answers. Today we provide those answers. We declare, yes, Sarah, we witness you. We believe you. We revere your bravery. And we will share your story so that other women who have been silenced, erased, and forgotten will understand that their voices, too, are significant. After the service, attendees laid blossoms upon Sarah's grave, lilies, roses, and wildflowers. Jerome's youngest daughter, a 10-year-old girl with Thomas's same resolute eyes, knelt and positioned a tiny toy angel beside the headstone. So she won't be lonely anymore, the child said. Maya reflected on all the other Sarah Daniels who had lived and perished in obscurity, their stories lost, their voices stilled. She considered how history is authored by the powerful how the official chronicle so frequently obliterates the testimonies of the marginalized and oppressed. But she also considered defiance, the innumerable methods people discover to leave evidence, to articulate truth even through silence. Sarah's hand signal, Thomas's testimony to the church committee, the reverends who documented the reality in their private journals, all of them forged a parallel archive, a counter-narrative that endured even as the sanctioned history attempted to destroy it. That evening, Maya sat in her home, the lights of the Charleston port shimmering beyond her window. She opened her computer and started composing a new article about other images in the Historical Society's collection. Other pictures she was now scrutinizing more intently, searching for details she might have previously missed, listening for other voices, awaiting an audience, for other stories insisting to be told. The portrait of Thomas and Sarah rested against her monitor. Maya looked at Sarah's face, which no longer seemed vacant, but resolute and purposeful, communicating across the centuries.